Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case because of some experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of regarding my ex's behavior out at networking events. After this initial call, he started calling on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. This wasn't someone I knew well prior to the separation, and he was much older than I was, but he claimed to have experience with divorce and custody, and I figured that it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him, since his testimony was important per my lawyer. I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day that my son was very sick, and when I told him that I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that, he was dropping by the house uninvited, or he would stop by with cookies for my son and etc. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce is coming soon, so I don't want to make this guy mad. He had called me out of the blue, and I was worried at this point that I was walking a very fine line between polite but clearly not interested, and that if he got mad, he might decide to go testify for my ex and say who knows what. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security cam system that my dad had mailed me, and at one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key the same day, and one evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and I wanted to do it alone. Just after the painting day, he came around, uninvited and unannounced, with the magazine photos of Decker, and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls, and I took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid a drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he would have gotten the hint, and it was a quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing, something like a zoo, and we both came back hot and tired. I put my kiddo down for a nap in my bed, and I decided to close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize that something was way off. As I'm blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table that I mostly definitely had not put there. There was a post-it note on it, something about planting it in the yard. I started shaking immediately because I recognized the handwriting and stood up to go splash some water on my face and decide whether to call my parents or the police. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized that the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended as like love notes or with affection, but which all scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how these notes could possibly have gotten into my house. My front door was definitely locked. But as I went from room to room, there were notes everywhere. And I mean hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets. There were even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing all of them and putting them into a pile, and when I got to one in the kitchen, that made my blood run cold. It said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." And I realized that there was a security camera pointed right where the note was left. The one that he had helped me set up for months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted that I should not call the police. Remember the custody battle? But that he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the security cameras. We had installed this to document if my ex tried to break into the house, so there was one on the front porch, but 3 inside the house, including one in my bedroom. This man could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for the past months. The security cameras, I realized, he had just paid attention to my passwords when I was setting up the system. But the only way that I can figure out that he got into my house is that he must have made a copy of my house key the day he had it. And because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put that many notes up quickly. And he was right next to my face and feet from my son while we were sleeping, and somehow thought that it was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. And when I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone and on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m., this man showed up at the door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left, which what felt like an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I am sure he had been drinking. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. I think he was crazy, but not that crazy, and I figured that if I called the police, he would get in more trouble if my son was there. But he knew the schedule, so I know it was him. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered that he had friended my mom on Facebook and was therefore still able to see all the photos of us that she posted or shared. And there was a huge argument when I saw, because she had left her computer logged in, a conversation that they were having about me and how it could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, and I'm still finding new notes even as I was packing. And I am more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online. Well, not the front anyway. And I have changed the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go, the networking events he attends, and I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos because I was traumatized enough, and I didn't want to see how much danger we could have been in. Hopefully, he never sees this post, but you know who you are, and I hope our paths don't cross again. So I was on my way home from Arby's with a mint chocolate shake. I zoned out for a second, and I almost didn't notice his car. I tried just letting him through, but he insisted that I go on ahead. I didn't think much of it, and I just continued on walking. He drove on ahead and parked his car near some apartments. He had on a black polo shirt, so I assumed he was just dropping something off for a job or something. And as I kept walking, he approached me and offered a $20 bill. I asked why, but I couldn't understand what he said in response, and I refused since I know what's best for me. However, that didn't deter him. He grabbed my waist and I stepped to the side. He then started pulling me towards his car. I bit his hand so he wouldn't silence me, and I made sure to scream as loud as possible to try and attract any bystanders if I could. He managed to get me into his car, and just before he could close it, I stuck my foot through the door to keep it open. I then got out and made myself go limp, since adding dead weight without warning creates sudden resistance and makes it harder for them to grasp you. Due to this quick thinking, I was able to get away unharmed. I quickly booked it and then got on the phone with my mom once I was at a safe distance. I made sure to stay on the phone until I got back. After that, I'd taken some time to calm down and then waited for the cops to get there to get my statement. The officer ended up praising my quick thinking, telling me that I'd luckily done everything right in this situation. Please, guys, take self-defense seriously. I've only ever had a week-long course, and just that alone had managed to save my life. I didn't remember too much from my self-defense course and only used the basic techniques that I'd remembered, which was making noise, dropping my weight, and checking behind me. Any other actions I'd taken were a result of logic and quick thinking. Chances are, if I'd gotten more self-defense training, it likely would have been as close of a call as it was. Also, never accept money from strangers. While there are good Samaritans, there's also people who don't have your best interest in mind. If you do think they have good intentions, make sure to double check by asking why they're offering you money. If you don't get a good legitimate reason, then make sure you refuse. And if you refuse and they still persist, get away immediately. This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at that time, and I had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and my 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio. We were surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m., so I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister to see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock, and it was around 2:30 a.m. My brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. Now, this really woke me up. We quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side, out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me that there were 2 guys who had been talking to each other and also knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and I grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure they weren't at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it is in direct view of the door. My brother was right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to try and find out what was going on. My parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and had come out to find these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, the men returned and began knocking again. despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time, in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards, and still knocking with the dog barking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away, and we all shuffled across the kitchen into the family room to peek outside the windows into our driveway, which is lit up by our outside light. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately the question was, where did the guys go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. They were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which enters into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David!" to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then two things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot this man. And secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared again, only to return to their knocking at the front. However, at this point, several minutes had gone by, and suddenly we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the two men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. Well, he didn't, and he was immediately tased and then fell onto the ground. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came out the front. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appears that both of them were drunk or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. And while they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, the whole experience wasn't fun. So, random man at our door in the middle of the night, let's not meet again.
I have quite a few horror stories from when I was a front desk attendant for a hotel, but most of them take place when I work the overnights for the same location. I have a lot of experiences with genuinely creepy and weird people, but I think it would be more fun to share one of the experiences that was a bit more unexplainable and less just this was one creepy guy. So, as I mentioned, I worked as the overnight front desk attendant for this hotel for a couple of years actually. The schedule kind of sucked, and I had to really work to adjust my sleep schedule, and it made days off incredibly difficult. But the pay was decent for the time, and I didn't have much going for me in my life beyond working there. The nights typically consisted of sitting at the front desk for hours, dealing with the one or two people that would show up in the middle of the night because they spent too much time on the road, and sometimes taking things up to rooms if there was an issue or emergency. Beyond that, I would sit at the desk and pretty much just file out the paperwork that had to be done each night. This story I want to share happened during my first year there. I don't recall the time of year, but I think it was in the early winter. The whole thing started when I got a call from the third floor of the building. It was a guest that had checked in at the beginning of my shift, and when I checked him in, he seemed like a pretty decent person. He seemed sane, stable, and polite enough. And I know it sounds weird that I'm saying this, but I'm saying this to demonstrate that he probably wasn't crazy. Anyways, he called down and asked if I could come help him, and he asked me if there was anything I could do about the temperature of the room. I mentioned there was a thermostat in the room, and that most of them were set to a pretty standard temperature, something like 73. He then said that it was set to 73, but the room was feeling cold by the door, like there was a draft coming in from the hallway. That was kind of weird since his room was literally in the middle of the hallway, so he was nowhere near any draft-causing spots like windows or exits. I told him I would come up and check it out shortly. After I hung up the phone, I went ahead and placed the "Be Right Back" sign on the desk and went up to the 3rd floor to see what was going on. When I got up there, I was a bit annoyed. The floor was a pretty standard temperature, but then I walked towards his room and noticed that this guy wasn't lying. As soon as I approached his door, it felt like the hallway went from this nice ambient temperature to about 20 degrees or so colder. We weren't booked full. There was only one other guest staying in a room near him, and their door didn't feel cold, so they didn't have the AC on or anything. But for some reason, the closer I got to his door, the colder it felt. I knocked on his door to let him know that I at least felt what he was talking about. When he answered, I told him that he was definitely correct. It was colder, but that I couldn't figure out what it was as there weren't any drafts, and there was nothing that should have been causing the colder temps. I then asked him if he wanted to move to another room, and after a bit of contemplating, he said that he would. We went through the whole process. I got him in another room down the hall, closer to the elevator, and apologized for the inconvenience. He seemed satisfied with my resolution, so we moved on, and I thought that was the end of it. Except about 20 minutes later, he called down to the front desk again. This time, he was a lot less happy. He started going off about how someone had knocked on his door multiple times, but then when he went to answer it, there was no one there. This was a really weird thing to have happening, mostly because, like I mentioned, there was only one other person near him, and that person was an older gentleman that looked like he was there for business, not the type to knock and run. I pulled up the camera system to check if I could see his door, and sure enough, I could. I asked him when the last time it happened was, and he started telling me that it started happening almost right away as soon as he got settled into his new room, and that had been happening every few minutes. He said that each time it happened, there would be no one on the other side of the door, so he assumed that they were knocking and running away. He then said that he had walked around the hallways and not seen anyone. As soon as he finished explaining this, I heard, clear as day, 3 very aggressive knocks on the door of his room come through the phone. He then got up and angrily said, "See, there's that SOB again." The problem was that I was staring at his door from the camera. There was no one there. I even kind of said that under my breath, and at first I don't think he understood what I said, because he said, "Right, because they knock and run away." I then reiterated my statement saying, "No, sir, I'm looking at your door from the camera, and there is no one there. As in, no one came to your door and knocked at all." He paused for a moment, but came back with a much less angry, much more confused tone, saying, "But you heard the knocking, right?" I told him that I did hear it, but said that at no point in time did anyone come to his door. Pretty much right away, we heard another very loud knock on the door, and he started saying, "Is there anyone there now?" To which I said no. I could tell that he was starting to freak out, and to be honest, I was as well. Between the weird drop in temperature around his old room, and now the phantom knocking, it seemed like some sort of spirit or ghost was following and messing with this guy. I know it was just 2 isolated incidents, but they were bizarre and were not things that we'd ever had reported. The knocking was definitely more terrifying than the cold spot, but both kind of had me leaning into supernatural territory. After a few seconds of silence, I offered to move him to one of the expensive rooms on another floor, basically upgrading him for free because of this. He did agree, and when he came down to the front desk, he was pretty pale and obviously freaking out. I asked if he was okay or if something else happened, and he told me that as he left his room with his stuff, he started hearing something laughing. I kind of passed over his comment and told him that we would get him taken care of. I got him in one of our most expensive rooms, which was not on the 3rd floor, and told him that if there were any more issues, I would go ahead with a full refund. He nodded and just slowly stepped back to the elevator with zero energy in his step. A few things to wrap the story up. First thing first, he did not have any more issues. When he checked out in the morning, I was told that he wanted to give praise to my manager for my handling of his issues, basically saying that I went above and beyond for him. And to anyone that will say that he was faking the issues or doing something to cause them, I'm going to say that I highly doubt it. The cold spot issue, I guess he could have had the AC on in the room, but that would be kind of dumb to do if I was coming up to see why it was so cold. Plus, it felt like it was more in the hallway than coming from his room. The knocking thing, I'm certain wasn't his doing. After I got him in the 3rd room, I actually went back and watched the camera footage, and unless he was so committed to the bit that he opened his door and looked around confused each time, and then left to walk around the hallway, and then angrily threw the door open for the act, all without knowing I could see him on camera, then I'm pretty certain it was real. On top of that, after he left his room, I saw him start to walk down the hallway and then pause to look back and around for what I'm assuming was the laughing. I watched the color drain from his face on that footage, and there's no real way to fake fear that intense. Also, this was the only complaint that I ever received about all this, which makes me seriously think that whatever this was directly attached to him. In the end, it was a super weird and genuinely creepy situation, and I felt bad for the guy. By the time he got into the new room, it was already past midnight, and I'm concerned he didn't sleep very well. I hope that this thing wasn't attached and was just messing with him for some reason, and I hope that he made it wherever he was going safely. And I'm also very sorry that your stay at our hotel was so eventful.
Starbucks is my favorite place to get coffee. Part of my morning ritual is to go there, get my coffee, and then go about my day. Unlike most of the population, I'm addicted to coffee. I'm not the friendliest person to talk to in the morning, and I can be standoffish. When my name was called out, and naturally it was spelled incorrectly, I had to squeeze past several men to get there. I tried doing the polite, "Excuse me," while I tried to move past, and one of the men didn't move. I gestured with my hand that I needed to make my way through. He moved, but just enough for me to get by and for me to rub against him. I cringed as I did so. He leaned in close, sniffed my hair, and made a creepy purr sound in my ear. I was completely repulsed by it. I grabbed my drink and made my way out as quickly as possible. I sipped and smiled at the flavor, when I heard a creepy voice in my ear. "I have something else you can taste." It was the same creeper from before. His breath smelled disgusting, and I pulled away from him. It was crowded and I don't think anyone heard what he said above the noise of the cafe. I stared at him in disgust and he leaned forward and winked at me. I pushed past him and made it out of the Starbucks. I was angry at this point, but I didn't want one idiot to ruin my day. But it was when I noticed that he was following me, and at first, I didn't worry about it too much. It was a busy street, and he could have been heading to wherever he had been heading. But about 5 minutes, I wanted to do a test and see if I was being paranoid about it. I turned into a street in the opposite direction of my school. The only other buildings was a small corner store and a beautician. 2 places that I didn't think he would go. But he kept following me. I was starting to get so worried now, I wanted to run away screaming. But instead, I went into the beautician's and pretended like I was looking at the prices. He was waiting outside. I leaned forward and I whispered to one of the women that he was following me and I was worried. At first, I don't think she believed me since he hadn't done anything yet. I waited there for 10 minutes and he was still waiting outside for me. She went outside and asked what the problem was. He didn't answer and just walked away. After I saw he left, I hurried to get to school and kept looking behind me to see if he was there. He wasn't. And every time I've gone to Starbucks, he hasn't been there. And I hope that I don't run into him again. And here are the top comments for my last video. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.